Today's Broadband Advisory Board meeting. First off, we're going to go ahead and do roll call. Sarah, can you do roll call, or do you want me to?
Yes, I've got it. Yep. Okay, so Antonio Martinez. Okay. And Jerry Enright.
Present.
Thank you, Jerry. Okay, Jeff Kraft is not with us. Greg Winkler is on vacation. So we're just waiting on Antonio. We have Jordan Beasley, Delilah Collins. Okay, Carrie Piecoach or Stephanie Bennett.
I'm here. Good morning.
Hi. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for joining. Welcome. Catherine Keegan.
Here. Hello.
Hi, Catherine. Catherine Redhorse.
Good morning.
Morning, Catherine. Jennifer Lewis.
This is Jennifer. Good morning.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining. And Andy Frohart. Okay, I think I saw he was going to be on vacation. So we have everyone who is planning to be here except for Antonio Martinez.
I'm here, Sarah.
Oh, there he is. Okay, great.
Yeah. And so, Sarah, we do not have a quorum. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So there will be no actions today at the board meeting. So we cannot approve any minutes or anything. We can review them, make any comments. Has everyone had an opportunity to look at last month's minutes? And if so, if you have any comments, we can take those, but we will not be voting on approving those minutes. Okay, hearing or seeing no one. CBO update. Who will be doing that today for us?
So I'm going to hand it over to Megan Gernert. She's going to give an update on our data collection. I'll just say really quickly that our next meeting is October 19th. It's going to be a really good one, so please participate. There'll be more information coming in this month. So go ahead, Megan.
Sarah, they're all good meetings. They are great,
Of
fabulous.
course. Of course they are. Thank you for that reminder.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Gernert. So I just want to give a quick update on our data collection. Let me grab my notes. So we completed the outreach for our fall data cycle at the beginning of this month. We received new granular data from 43% of providers, and we confirmed granular data from 8% of providers that we already had in our system, which gives us a total of 51% of providers have granular data on file, which is like an amazing improvement. I know numbers don't really mean a lot when you don't have anything to compare them to, but we usually have a response rate, a total response rate of about 30%. So having that 51% is pretty amazing. I wanted to also point out how that affects OIT's wildly important goals. So OIT has 5 wildly important goals. We call them WIGs. WIG number 4 is to expand broadband access. And we measure that by our measure of success for that is improving data accuracy. To measure that, we created a subset of our providers that we call the top 15 providers. It's basically representative of, there's wireline and wireless and big and small and everything in that 15. Our goal was to increase the amount of accurate data from those providers from the 2 we had before up to 5. So I'm happy to announce we got 8 more of those providers to give us accurate data, bringing us up to 10, which blows our goal of 5 out of the water. So we're really excited about that. I want to thank my GIS team, Alex Gleason and Christy Ganser. I think they should be on this meeting somewhere, so maybe they can wave hi. They did an amazing job collecting this data, adapting to the legislative changes, all while short-staffed. So I want to thank them and introduce them to the folks who haven't met them yet. They're rock stars. And then I just wanted to mention also that the data should be processed by the end of the month or so, and we'll have our public broadband map updated in early October. We'll send that info out once it's all updated and ready to go. And I think Sarah signed off, so I am handing it over to, I think, to Ed Mills for an update on the Lunch and Learn that is next Tuesday.
Yes, just sent you a link if you're interested. Please join us for the Colorado Broadband Office Lunch and Learn on September 28th, 2021. That's at noon. And this month's webinar, we will feature Josh Kramer. He's a network architect for Trailblazers Broadband in Estes Park. And he's going to be sharing Estes Park's story of starting up a municipal broadband utility from scratch, establishing a multi-municipality wide area network in the Front Range, and maintaining upstream connectivity in a mountain town through a variety of natural disasters. And they'll give some use cases, and you won't want to miss this one. It will be exceptional. And again, you have the link there in the chat section. Just go ahead, click that link, and then you'll have to fill out a little bit of information so that we can get you registered, but it's going to be a good one. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. Okay, so I also forgot to mention, if you have any questions on the data update or for Ed on the Lunch and Learn, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we can provide answers to those questions. I think that is it for the CBO updates. So I guess I will hand it back to Bob for public comment.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everybody helping out there. That's great progress. So next up, we have set aside 20 minutes in total for public comment, of which each speaker can speak up to 3 minutes. If I'm going off memory, off the rules here, Sarah, so I'm sure you can kick me in the shins if I go off the rails a little bit. But I believe we set 3 minutes aside for each public comment person or presenter. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to ask or bring any public comment to the board? Seeing or hearing none, I think we will move right on over to Teresa, I believe is our next, and she will host and moderate this. This is actually a pretty good session, and really great job pulling this together, Teresa and the team. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and so I'll hand it over to Teresa.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. Good morning, rest of the board members. I believe we might have a couple of legislators potentially on and representatives of the public. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm Teresa Ferguson. I'm the Director of Federal Broadband Engagement with the Colorado Broadband Office, and I'll be the moderator, as Bob indicated today, for our panel discussion, featuring some good friends of mine, but more importantly, national broadband leaders from across the country. So we have invited these national experts to share their state's broadband mission and policies. In addition, we want to hear how their states are spending or planning to spend historic levels of federal infrastructure funding. We chose a panel format to generate a conversation among the panelists. They know each other, and I'm hoping that they're going to jump in and just talk over each other at times, add ideas or suggestions. I mean, these guys do, they do know each other, and we're going to make sure we make this pretty casual. We're going to, though, leave at least 15 to 20 minutes for the audience questions and answers following that panel discussion. So first, I want to introduce you to each of our panelists, and I'll ask each of the panelists to give a brief 2-minute or 3-minute introduction of their state's broadband journey, and then we'll dive into the panel discussion. But first, I would be remiss if I don't cover a few logistics here. To prevent background noise, please keep yourself muted during the panel. discussions. As I mentioned, we've allowed sufficient time for Q&A. So, following the panel discussion, but if you're like me and you're worried you're going to forget questions, please feel free to enter questions in the chat at any time during the panel discussion, and the Broadband Advisory Board staff will read your questions during the Q&A. Following the panel discussion, we'll provide an opportunity for you to even unmute yourself. If you want to talk to the panelists directly, let's do that in the Q&A session. So today's webinar will be recorded and available on the Broadband Advisory Board's portion of the Colorado Broadband Office's website. Before we jump into our panelists' opening remarks, I want to share a little bit about you guys. I want to brag on you a little bit, okay? And first, and in no particular order, I don't want anybody to get mad here, I'm going to start with Peggy. So Peggy Schafer is the Executive Director of the Connect Me Authority, Maine's program to expand broadband to unserved areas of the state. Prior to joining Connect Maine, Peggy was a small business advocate in the Secretary of State's office and served as a founder and co-chair of the Maine Broadband Coalition, a statewide advocacy organization that is focused on expanding high-speed broadband. Peggy has served as the Chief of Staff in the Senate Majority Office and Senate President's Office, and worked as the lobbyist for the Department of Economic Development and Community Development in Maine. Next is Russ Elliott. Russ is the Director of the Washington State Broadband Office and has built the office from its beginnings, right? Prior to his appointment, Russ established the Wyoming Broadband Office. You're just hopscotching across the West, aren't you there, Russ? Russ's experience includes building and owning one of Colorado's largest independent CLECs, amassing over 14,000 customers across Western Colorado and northern New Mexico. As a past service provider, I think it gives Russ a unique perspective as in his new public sector leader role. He has identified and established creative public-private partnerships and conversations to address all of those last mile challenges that we all face. Next is Leslie Dandridge Durham. She is Governor John Bell Edwards' designee to the Delta Regional Authority. In addition to that role, Governor Edwards has appointed her to the Jobs for American Graduate Louisiana Board of Directors, to the Rural Water Infrastructure Committee, the Broadband for Everyone in Louisiana Commission, the Rural Revitalization Commission, and the 4.9 gigahertz Spectrum Task Force. Leslie basically has her fingers in most of the critical infrastructure in her state, and she has a broad perspective regarding what it will take to connect Louisiana's communities to broadband. And finally, Matt Schmidt will join us at the top of the hour. Matt has a conflict today and won't be able to join us till noon, but I promise you'll want to hang around and hear what Matt has to say. Matt directs the Illinois Office of Broadband and chairs the Illinois Broadband Advisory Council. In these capacities, he oversees the administration of the $400 million and growing Connect Illinois Broadband Grant Program designed to extend universal broadband connectivity throughout the state. Prior to his work in Illinois, Matt served in the Minnesota State Senate, where he drafted successful legislation to create the state's Office of Broadband and Border-to-Border Grant Program in 2013. Now that you know a little bit about our panelists, I want to dive into some questions. So Russ, Leslie, Peggy, you guys all ready? Or did I put you to sleep with your intros about how wonderful you are? Okay, here we go. So guys, why don't you, just start us a little bit off with your mission, your office. Give us 2-3 minutes on your journey here. Well, how about we start with Peggy, since I started with you.
So the Connect Maine was created by a legislative task force in 2006, got up and running in 2007. Our mission bluntly is to bring broadband to everybody in the state and make sure they know how to use it. We have two basic programs that we offer to the public. One is a community planning grant and the other is an infrastructure grant. We are also really in charge of broadband policy for the state. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to do this better and how to do it smarter. And we've done a bunch of stuff through mapping and continual improvement, we call it. I'm sure our constituents don't call it that way. We call it continual improvement to our broadband program. I think one of the things that makes Maine unique is the human infrastructure we have built across the state of people who are engaged in broadband. And that's been, it's been really helpful as we begin to have these community conversations across the state about how to expand broadband. And it's really important to bring in lots of different voices. And so I think we are funded two ways. One is by a small service charge on phone bills. And the other, we just got a state bond issue, which is state funding, the state's borrowing money for us to do an expanded infrastructure projects. It's about $15 million. And then last fall, we used some CARES money to do a special project around connecting the kids across, it had a very short time frame because it was CARES money. And so we were able to connect about 700 students through that process.
We'll dig into that one just a little bit more, I think, Peggy. That's one of my follow-up questions. You're getting ahead of me here.
Sorry.
Good thing. You always are. No, you always do. Hey, Russ, why don't you give us a little, give us the teaser, the 30-second elevator pitch of what's happening in Washington.
Well, happy to do it, Teresa. And hello, Colorado. It's good to be back at home here. This is my home state, so it's good to be back. And Peggy and I are in the same house. Obviously, we've painted our walls the same, and we're, she's just in the other room. I'm in this room. So anyway, glad to be here. Washington State Broadband Office Director, and we stood this thing up from Senate Bill 5511. It was a Senate push, and just that legislation developed a goal for the state, and I think that's been my best asset, is that I've got a goal here that's pretty aggressive. It's 150 symmetrical to every citizen in the state by 2028. So we're not screwing around up here. We're going after it, and we're building future-proof, scalable infrastructure, and that's what we're planning on doing. And in order to do that, we need money. We've also identified some of the challenges for some of our more rural areas and some of our more economically disadvantaged areas, and I'll go into that later in a little bit. But we've really believed here in Washington that broadband now is a community up discussion, not a provider down discussion. Providers need to be at the table, but the communities need to be involved in this conversation. So we've built a process here called Broadband Action Teams. We've got about 38 of them in the state, and those are local regional teams, kind of like your local planning teams there, that you have in Colorado. We're similar here with the Broadband Action Teams, and we make certain the right players are in those team meetings, and we're really working at the county level and build broadband up. But I'll talk a little bit more about the stuff that we're doing here later on, but that's kind of the high level view of what we're doing here.
Thanks, Russ. Yeah, we want to dig into that just a little bit deeper. Those local action teams are, I think, are some best practices, right, that we need to all think about. So Leslie, come on, give us a little bit of the history and the journey of broadband in Louisiana. I love you're a great storyteller. So I'm gonna keep you short. You got to just give me about 2 or 3 minutes here so we can dive into some of these questions.
I will. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Colorado. Excited to be here and to be with my colleagues. I actually wouldn't be here if it wasn't for these folks. So you've got an A team speaking to you today. So good job, Teresa. The Louisiana story is a little short. We actually just kind of got kicked off in 2019, the spring of 2019, when the Delta Regional Authority, which is who I represent Governor Edwards on the board of, is a federal organization that has grants available for Delta communities around the Mississippi River. So they decided that novel idea, broadband, is infrastructure. Wow. I was so excited. I wanted to get back home and tell our broadband people, and I got back home and found out we didn't have any. So we got to work, put together a broadband plan, a state plan, with the help of Teresa and Peggy and Russ and a few others. Couldn't have done it without them. By the end of 19, we had put together the Broadband for Everyone in Louisiana Commission. And then, of course, 2020, you know what happened there. But something else happened in 19. Teresa, if you'll let me expand just a little bit. We were trying to put together a commission and trying to get on our feet. Mississippi was actually passing legislation allowing their electric co-ops to provide broadband, and Arkansas, to our north, was actually passing legislation to allow municipalities to provide broadband. Now, Louisiana, our electric co-ops could provide broadband, but they didn't. None of them did. But our municipalities are not allowed to even be in the same room when broadband is being discussed. So that wasn't that we were far away from that. Well, then COVID happened. All of a sudden, we get some legislation passed to create a broadband office if we get funds. I know you got some legislators on this call. I hope that they don't do that, but they do that in Louisiana. And so we had a empty hull and we didn't have anything in it. Well, then CARES Act came through. We still weren't ready. We got ARPA money and was able to fund our broadband office with that. And we are just now getting to where we are starting to take in some applications. We also passed some legislation to encourage our electric co-ops to provide broadband. And we were able to slip in a little legislation this year to allow our municipalities to own broadband infrastructure, not be providers, but own the infrastructure. And one other little tidbit, we talked the Delta Regional Authority into actually paying for our broadband mapping program for the entire Delta Regional Authority footprint, which is 252 counties and parishes. Louisiana didn't have a map. We were shooting darts in the dark. And so this was a great way to get some crowdsourcing on the ground information, and we didn't have to pay for it.
Leslie, thank you so much. It's perfect to get us started, and it kind of gives context for the struggles that you guys have faced. I guess I want to dig a little deeper then into each of your programs that existed pre-federal funding, right? So help us understand, the state of Colorado we have a state last mile grant program that is in place, and we'd like to know a little bit more though about yours. So Peggy, you mentioned that you have a planning grant and an infrastructure grant. What size, scope? Help me kind of get an idea of how much funding your state is putting into those programs annually without the federal funding, and then kind of how it's governed, and how do you determine who gets the grants and who doesn't?
So our Connect Maine has a board. We're quasi-independent. So the staff, the two of us, are state employees in the Office of Broadband under the governor. And we are, we have a board of directors that are appointed by the governor who then sort of oversee the program. We have statutory responsibilities around infrastructure grants and community planning grants. Our funding, our ongoing funding that comes in every year is what we call in Maine other special revenue, is about $1.5 million a year. So it's not a lot of money. And so up until 2020, we were doing probably somewhere between 700 and maybe $1 million, 100,000 a year. Million would be high. We are planning grants roughly, we spend probably $60,000 to $100,000 a year on those, depending on demand. As we've gone forward, we've learned about a bunch about these programs, but the way our rule is structured, we have to look at a couple things. One is greatest relative improvement. So to score well, you have to improve service better than other people in the same pool. And the cost, and the way the rule was structured, cost actually came in 3 or 4 times in the scoring mechanism, making it a little hard for us to really get to the more rural areas, which are more expensive. And so this year we are both changing our rule and making a drastic change to our scoring process to look at a weighted cost per pass based on state priorities. So we're going to have essentially buckets, we call them priorities. And the first priority will be people with the lowest quality service that get the greatest improvement. And the second is we are weighting the cost per pass and the match based on density. So the lower density, the fewer people there are, the better you're going to score in our score process. So we're really taking a very different look at how we're doing this by weighting different measures that the state feels is important. But traditionally, our grants have been really based on cost. And really, it has been, we just open the door and people come in with applications and we score them competitively. We're working very hard to change that structure. Right now, we're actually talking about, we're going to, because we have gotten very into the mapping process, we're client of Vetro. They're developing what we call a broadband intelligence platform for us. We're trying to bring all the data in together, sort of like Colorado is. Better data from the providers, better data from databases, and really have an understanding. And so we're going to put out areas that are eligible for grants this year. So that's a very different change. Before we were like, come on in, we'll look at them all. This year we're saying, okay, these are the areas that we think are the worst served, that we want to get served first.
And that's, I assume, Peggy, as a result of kind of lessons learned,
Yes,
right? You
absolutely.
need to modify and mature the program, right?
And the universe has changed. I mean, let's
Right.
all not forget, many of our states put out a broadband action plan in January of 2020. Yay! In March of 2020, it was irrelevant, right? It was completely irrelevant.
Absolutely.
The world has drastically changed about who now is demanding broadband, and also the funding piece. So I think it's really important as you guys get going to think about the big picture, right? To think about what you want for economic outcomes, what you want for, and how you're going to get there. And, Russ and I are both big believers in this community planning. He's got action teams, we call them community planning grants. They are so important because these communities, these are the places, these are the locuses of interest that then you can get a provider or somebody interested in coming there because you have potentially a take rate, and you're also combining demand. This whole community planning process is central to how we're going to figure out how to expand broadband in this country. And one last thing, the important thing about the community planning process is because this is long-term infrastructure, the community really needs to have a voice in what they get and how they get it.
Perfect segue, Peggy, into Russ. So Russ, I know your program, you started from the ground up, you're running fast and hard. So everybody knows though, the legislature did in Washington state set you up for success with funding. So give us a little, structure around that and how you're intending to use that money.
Yeah, so to Peggy's point, we were broadband before broadband was cool, right? We were all doing this when we were all wallflowers at the dance, and the minute COVID happened, broadband offices became prom kings and queens, right? I mean, that we became the focus of critical infrastructure in the country. So prior to that, this office had some legislation. There was a broadband office that was established in the legislation. They established my position. They established a small grant out of the general fund. It was about $20 million for broadband infrastructure. So you've got this 150 megabit symmetrical goal for every citizen in the state, and you have $20 million in your pocket. I mean, that right away became a problem, right? So I had to educate folks on the fact that goal. The other thing they had too, which was kind of interesting, is and I answered Jerry here who asked about the how it came about. In that legislation, they also said by 2024 we're going to have 25.3 to everybody. Well, anybody that understands broadband understands that you don't get to 150 symmetrical by establishing 25.3 infrastructure. So this was set up not for success. It was set up kind of, hey, these sound like good numbers, and this is what we'll do, And to my luck, the 150 symmetrical has been what I've hung on to. That's been where we're at it, and we're going to continue to do that. And to extend on what Peggy said there, not only do we have this money now through these federal programs, but we are now obligated by these funds to deliver future-proof scalable infrastructure because we are borrowing against my 6-year-old's future. Our kids are going to be paying this back. So we best not be doing what the federal government's been doing for the last 20 years, building infrastructure that once it's done being built, it's got to be refunded again to be torn up and replaced. So we better be building future-proof scalable infrastructure. It's our obligation now as leaders in this initiative. So we've set up this state to really focus on fiber infrastructure as far out as we can get it. We'll look at technologically agnostic services. Believe me, I built them all over Western Colorado, Northern New Mexico. I understand, the challenges of last mile delivery and the cost of that infrastructure. But we really, with the new types of funds that are out there, when you're talking billions and trillions, we have to start thinking about building infrastructure, to the highest degree that we can. And so we're really committed here to try to get fiber out as far as we can. We'll look at other alternatives once we get past that. And we've established some of those ARPA funds into a state broadband office grant now. We've got $350 million. We're not competitive. We are cooperative and collaborative. I don't believe in competitive grants, especially for these small communities. We've got 29 tribes here in Washington state. If I made them competitive and forced them to walk through the hoops, a lot of them wouldn't be able to do it because they just don't have the capacity. They don't have the knowledge to fill out applications and grant forms and that kind of stuff. So to that end, we also identified those as barriers. So the barriers we had here were feasibility studies. People didn't know how to do them, how to build a network. They didn't understand how to start to establish what the costs would be. 2, write grants. They didn't know how to do that. It was too expensive. Most of these small towns and small communities, the people that are heading up broadband are heading up the hardware store, coaching football and doing other things. So they didn't have time to write a grant, So grant writing. And then number 3 was a lot of these less fortunate communities that economically are disadvantaged didn't have the funds to go and find federal fund matching. We knew it right away when we didn't have the ARPA money before this whole COVID thing. We knew we were going to have to go chase federal funds. So we had to remove the barriers to go be successful at that. So we're set up now where we're now, in the past we'd get 1 or 2 applications in. We're getting in about 10 to 12 applications each time a federal round comes up. And we're, as an office, partnering with folks to go out and chase those monies. And then those folks that chase federal money will also get preferential treatment in our state plan. When we have the $350 million that we do here. So they're going out chasing those funds. We're going to also reward them with, with some additional funds here from our state program that we'll be doing. So that's what we're doing here. Again, the mapping thing has been critical for us. As you know, we kind of pioneered a little bit of a crowdsourcing effort up here, and I've really appreciated it. It's been my go-to tool because I don't believe broadband is anymore talking about shape files or fabrics or census blocks. I think we've got to go door to door and street to street. And that's what it is now. And anybody that's built networks understands that one side of the street may have been built, the other side didn't. So we have to be able to talk intelligently about where that is. And by doing these crowdsourced mappings and the things that we're doing here, we empower those communities to have a more intelligent conversation with providers and with public infrastructure. So, that's what we're doing up here. And we've gone far left on the public side up here. And I've been fighting to bring that back to center because I think, if you say it's got to all be public, you're wrong. If you say it's all got to be private, you're wrong. Somewhere in the middle is the right. There's no playbook for that. You have to have those delicate, those conversations, and that's what we're working through here to try to make certain we're taking advantage of our public infrastructure as well as our private expertise.
So Leslie, I'm going to get you in on this conversation, about your existing program that you have for grants. And how, everybody's touched a little on mapping. I want to get into mapping a little bit later, more in depth, because I know Peggy and Russ, you guys have both done some, cutting edge stuff in that regard as well. But Leslie, I'm going to ask you to give us just a little bit of background on Louisiana's grant program and how you see it. Is it helping out, like Russ is talking about, and Peggy, strategic planning, or is it directly for infrastructure? Or how are you guys, navigating how you engage the communities and providers in navigating, identifying where the needs are and addressing them?
Well, thank you for that question. Our program hasn't even completed taking in our first round of applications yet. So when Peggy talks about, learning from best practices and what didn't work last time, we're having to learn from y'all, you and Peggy and Russ. So we've taken some information from a couple of different states and just kind of meshed it together and put together some matrix. And most of it centers around cost and in areas that don't have 25.3, which is most of Louisiana. So, that's kind of what the whole program is right now. And it's actually geared toward providers, which is unfortunate in my opinion. So my background is grants and not broadband, just grant infrastructure type projects. So with that in mind, we are really targeting, and forgive me for if I'm jumping off, but I feel like this is perfect for what they just said. And I wanted to make sure that you in Colorado hear this, and you may already be doing this. It may be Louisiana that's behind, but we didn't have public-private partnerships. There was no such thing. It was all providers. When I tell you that our local governments couldn't be in the same room with the discussion, I'm not kidding. They could not participate at all by law. It was illegal. So now they can own the infrastructure. So if you look at it from the perspective of leveraging funds, and you don't just look at pots of money for certain things, broadband is infrastructure. And if you're going to use, our opinion is, if you're going to use public money for infrastructure, it needs to be Cadillac that's going to last a long time, not something that's you're going to put in there in 5 years, you got to replace it. So we're looking at communities, local governments getting grant funding, state and federal, and sometimes both, for fiber and putting it where they need it, and then partnering with a provider or multiple providers to use that fiber. And that way, the providers, what I'm told is they are saving $27,000 a mile by partnering and doing this. Now, that's a lot of money where I'm from. Teresa talks about, oh, she's got cows and bulls up there that can't get uploaded because they're $50,000 bulls that need to be uploaded to an auction. And I'm talking about people that don't have water, don't have basic necessities. So y'all may not have all these problems, but this is what we're facing. And what is a real public-private partnership, and how do we leverage those funds? And I think the real question at the end of the day is, what is your goal? Our goal is so we are providing high quality, affordable broadband to our constituents. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to all come together and suck it up, put the egos aside, put whatever it is to the table, and really have an actual partnership. And I think leveraging those funds is just the start.
That's a perfect segue also, Leslie, in regard to having skin in the game, right? Who are the players? Who's all contributing? How are you handling the various players, providers, and funding sources? So I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to go to Russ next and kind of hit you up with, how has your state, Russ, navigated the process of determining how to spend we're seeing historic levels of funding, right? From, ARPA and CARES and all of that. What are you guys doing to target funding, especially in, the CARES Act and ARPA funding can be used for many things, but how are you targeting it for broadband? What's that look like in Washington State?
Yeah, so where we go right away is we're trying to serve the unserved first. I mean, before we start passing out seconds, people got to get firsts, right? So what we do is we've defined in our legislation, that same bill, we define 25.3 as unserved. So anybody less than 25.3 is on the table for consideration for any of the funds we have. So that's where we go first. We are now, because if I'm going to get this 150 symmetrical goal on the road, we've got to change that 25.3. We're going to change that to 100 by 20. So we're going quick, rapid, fast. We're going to move that unserved, to 100 megabit. So at that time, we'll start to see a lot of these areas really open up for opportunity, and we'll start to try to get out there. We'll continue to maintain our focus on the 25.3 first, right? So we're going to get to those really deep rural unserved areas first, but we are going to start to build those infrastructures up and get a little bit more robust infrastructure in those areas where we need it. The big deal for us is we don't want to overbill, right? So, we have to have that. We have to have the understanding, especially in our small rural areas. We have a lot of rural incumbents up here, small incumbent telephone companies that started out as cooperatives that, are doing the right things in these small communities and are building good. I know you got some in Colorado, and Farmers Telephone down in Southwest Colorado was a fantastic little telephone company, and they were building fiber to the home back in, late 90s, I think, early 2000s. So they were doing the good things that need to be done there. So we don't want to unintentionally overbuild that infrastructure. We don't want to be, in there competing and taking away from that little business's, business model. So we always continue to focus on trying to serve those communities with best infrastructure and the most effective approach. Sometimes it is public infrastructure. Here in Washington State, we've got a lot of PUDs, which are kind of rural electric cooperatives, and the PUDs up here have a few of them print money because they have dams, and as a result, they're able to leverage some of those funds for infrastructure, and they've done some fantastic work in 3 or 4 of these counties. They built out 75-80% of the county on fiber to the prem. So it's been exciting to see that. So there is no playbook again. This is just kind of feel it as you go along and do things that make sense. As Peggy said, learn from your history and continue to try to do those creative things to get the most effective infrastructure out as far as you can. So, we're continuing to do that. And again, we look to partner with those that have the experience. There's a question over here about, M&O, that ongoing factor to make certain that those networks are operational. Hence the reason too, you want to work with those providers that already have proven it, the proven track record of being able to be successful. You get those one-time funds out there to where you offset that 90% cost of broadband, which is digging up the ground or hanging on wires on poles. the model for return on investment's a little bit more lucrative and a little bit more attractive. And so you can make it work for folks out there. But you have to, again, you have to continue to look at that. And with some of the mapping technologies we have, some of the tools that we have, we're able to look at some of those feasibility studies and see what the 5-year projections or pro formas are going to be, so that we know that those have the capability of being successful even with a low adoption. So we have to be looking at that. It's a constant balancing act. There is no, this is exactly how you do it and this is the way we do it. We're just continuing to look at it in a creative
Hey, Russ, not to let you off too much, did Washington appropriate any specific amount of funds from CARES or ARPA specifically for broadband? That's kind of I was looking for a dollar amount and when you've got to spend it by.
Yeah, we get a little bit out of the capital fund. I think there was about 50 million out of the capital fund and about 300 million out of the infrastructure fund. So total out of ARPA, I think we allocated about 356 million. We pat ourselves in the back, but I look at what's going on over in North Carolina. They did 1.2 billion. California's done 6 billion.
Right.
Montana did 350 million with the little tiny money they got. There's some states that are going all in on broadband. I'm proud of those states. I don't let our state off the hook. I tell them that that's great, you made an ante, but we got to double down.
Well, I appreciate that, because that's what we're trying to give people on this call, on this panel, or the audience, to know what kind of scale in comparison to other states. So Peggy, what do you have for CARES and ARPA for Maine? What have you guys committed up there for broadband specifically?
So the CARES funding, which was originally supposed to end in December of 2020, and then at the very last minute, like I think the 28th of December, got an extension until the end of 2021. We had $12 million of that money, but because we got it in late October and it had to be done by late December, we couldn't really get all of that 12 million out the door. We did get 6 million out the door. So that's the CARES money. And all but one project is done on that. We had one that had some pole attachment issues, and I think they're close to wrapping up. The American Rescue Plan has, as you know, like multiple parts to it. The state funding, also known as the 602 funding, the state funding, the state, I think I forget what we're getting total, but I think we're putting 21 million of that money into broadband infrastructure. And then the capital projects fund, which is also part of the ARPA grant, guidelines just came out yesterday, and where the state is getting about 128 million. So over the next year, we'll have about $150 million to spend. That's on top of the $15 million bond. So roughly 165 million over the next year to start the investment cycle, because as we all know, the infrastructure package is coming someday, and that has a huge chunk of money in it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate, the capital projects fund. I was going to put you guys on the spot a little later and ask you what your thoughts are on the guidance. So we'll get into that one. Yeah. Yeah,
our towns actually also got towns and counties got money. And so that varies across the state. There's a lot of our broadband groups, the community groups, are working directly with their community and with their counties to get some of that money dedicated to broadband. In Maine, we don't have a very strong county infrastructure at all. They run jails and the sheriff's department and the probate office. And so it's unusual for them to have this kind of money. And so they're kind of fumbling with it. I will say for all of you, for the American Rescue Plan money, broadband is very clearly an allowed expense, very clearly an allowed expense. So if your towns are sort of wondering, or counties are sort of wondering, well, what would you do with this? Broadband is very clearly and very easily one of the allowed expenses.
Thanks, Peggy. And if you think of it, I'm gonna pivot to Leslie right now. But if you think of it or have a sense of scope or scale, how many of your towns did commit funding to broadband to develop those public-private partnerships? I'd love to hear kind of ballpark numbers on that if you can recall it.
We don't know yet, because the money's just come in, and so the towns are all working through this. So we don't know how many the counties are certainly working through this. We don't. So this is an ongoing conversation in our state about how the towns spend their money, and can the counties help leverage that town money to leverage state money.
Perfect. Leslie, so in CARES and ARPA, did your legislature or governor's office, was there an appropriation specifically for broadband out of those pots of money? And I recognize some are work in progress, but can you give us some scope and scale?
Yes, well, totally brand new. We had minus money when we got started. Matter of fact, I believe y'all had someone from EDA on your call last time. Talked a lot about partnerships. That's what we do, a lot of that talking on our federal side with grants of all different kinds, and talking about ARPA money. We're actually, our governor has instructed our communities to use ARPA money for water and sewer basic infrastructure first. And then because our basic infrastructure is in bad shape. So we've got like 70% of our drinking water infrastructure is failing right now. So we are pushing our communities to address those. But, if you're gonna dig some water lines, it's kind of easy to go ahead and get just a little bit more money and lay down some fiber while you're doing that. So that's what we're hoping that they do with that ARPA money. But we did carve out this summer, our legislature carved out 180 million. It's not much in the grand scheme of things, but considering that we had nothing of the ARPA money to be able to use that for broadband initially. And like I said, that program just goes to providers only. And so we are working with our local governments to be able to access all of the other funding that's for infrastructure. So it sounds like we have a very small pot of money, but we're looking at doing some leveraging and accessing other funding. So it's not really as small as what it sounds like.
180 million doesn't sound small to me, Leslie. I appreciate that.
When everybody else is putting it, Tennessee, how much is Tennessee? Is like $1 billion. They're serious. Here we are. In 2019, we received one USDA grant. One Reconnect grant. It was for $15.5 million. And we had not received one in a while. That was a big deal. And the only reason we got that grant was because they had one area that had 10-1. We were still focused on 10-1 issues. And then 2020 happened. And here the whole time, Tennessee saying, well, we're putting down 100-100. Like, I don't know how we go from 10-1 to 100-100. You know how you do it? You have a pandemic. So now everybody's jumps from 10-1 to 25-3 to 120 or 100-100. And so that's how we do it. And man, if you don't jump out there and get that scalable up there, shame on you, shame on all of us. And to answer one of the questions in the chat, Peggy and Russ and I all have, we use the same folks for the crowdsourcing mapping. And so they do our testing. So I'm a full believer of that program, and I took lessons from both Peggy and Russ. A great crowdsourcing. We're not being told what is out there. What's on the ground, what they're using, how much it's going to cost, how much it's what the community can do. There's all kinds of analytics that go along with it, and we are super excited to have it.
Thanks, Leslie. I wanted to ask you guys just briefly, Leslie brought this up, they're looking at all the funding sources that are out there. How useful, Peggy, Russ, Leslie, how useful has USDA's Reconnect program been, FCC's RDOF, NTIA, we're just getting into those, right? The BIP program and the required covered partnerships and the tribal connectivity program in general, and in a 30,000 foot, how useful have those federal programs been for your state to close the gap? Well, Russ, or Peggy. Yeah. Peggy's already on. Go, Peggy.
I'm not a really big fan of USDA, right? I'm just not. It's a very bureaucratic organization. Their insistence on you can't on at least 90% of the area has to have less than 10-1. Leaves anybody with over 10-1 still in the dark, right? It's I don't know where they got that number from. It's antiquated. I think they did get it from Congress. It's antiquated, and they have the ability to upgrade it, and they should have 3 years ago. We had 4 grants in that first round. One of them has pulled out because the USDA essentially was so bureaucratic they couldn't build anything else. 3 of them are municipal builds, and all of them are still pending. None of them have hung a thing yet. It's 2021. None of them have even applied for pole attachment yet. So what I tell people in our community is, if you have really bad service and you need 75% grant, USDA may be the route, but be aware of what actually is happening with that program, because it's very bureaucratic and very expensive. Actually, there's a bunch of expenses that are not anticipated until they bring the bureaucracy down as you build the network out. We actually got a Community Connect grant for a small island off the coast of Bar Harbor, Cranberry, and they still haven't gotten the money. We did the opening. We cut the ribbons with the USDA in 2019, and they have not yet seen a dime from the USDA. So, there's some processes there. I think the RDOF funding is still pending, right? We have some. Our big incumbent provider, Consolidated Communications, got a bunch of RDOF areas. They clearly intend to build gig fiber to those areas. They have a time frame. We don't know what it is, but they have a time frame over the 5 years. They've figured out how to chunk out those projects. We have one small provider that applied and got money to build out a bunch of areas near their footprint, and they're going to build gig service. So I think we're hopeful that those are going to be successful. A big chunk of Maine got sold off to Starlink, which is not a community choice. And B, really, it's a last mile service. And the problem with it is that if the feds consider the RDOF area as served as far as their federal funding and they're not eligible anymore, then the community really never gets a voice in an affordable service. And so I think Starlink has absolutely a role to play in this. Whether it's as big as what the feds allowed them to bid on is a whole question.
So Peggy, what I'm hearing out of you is, reconnect, long lead time. Same thing I'm hearing in RDOF. I mean, the auction was in October of last year, right? We're approaching, and then they have 6 years to build it, right? So I'm hearing a reoccurring theme here in that these are longer lead times. The evaluation process, the critical analysis each of the agencies does really drags the process out. Russ, are you using any of these programs or do you hear your legislators saying, oh, let's wait, there's these federal programs out here like Reconnect and RDOF, they're going to solve our issues? Or how are you navigating that, right, when you're talking to your legislators?
Yeah, so this office is optimistic that we can chase some of that USDA money, because it is big money. But to Peggy's point, we've got folks that have been awarded here and we've not paid yet. It is an arduous process. I don't know that they're the best avenue, but they are the avenue right now as far as federal funds are concerned. RDOF and CAF are a mess. That was a waste for this country. For us to have ran that $9 billion fund out before we had any understanding of where that money needed to go it's criminal. And to allocate these funds to companies that are unproven, that are not substantiated at scale, I think is a crime. Handing money back to companies that have not historically performed is a crime. I mean, I think we really missed the boat on this last round of RDOF. We had $20 billion sitting there waiting to be spent, and we just needed to do a better job of understanding what the problem is we were trying to solve, right? So this coming from Wyoming, CAF was the biggest mistake that ever happened. I mean, they allocated half that state to satellite, and then that state's no longer, able to take advantage of any of those federal funds. So and that happened in Washington State too. And then here comes the next round with RDOF, and we certainly helped SpaceX prove out the technology here because we have them here. We did some creative tests with them, but at the same time, then they went and took that and showed that as a proof of concept so they can go get RDOF money, and that happened. And RDOF in a lot of areas that I think now, with the type of infrastructure funds we're seeing, it's a waste of time not to build physical infrastructure, the folks that we can now reach with our billions and trillions coming out of the federal government. So let's rethink this. Let's sit back. And again, I don't know that anybody at the federal level has any idea the unique opportunities in each of these states. We have public utility districts. There's only 2 states in the country that have them. Us in Nebraska, legislative mandates that they can't use them. And so let's allow the states to have some creative discretion here. That's why I am a huge proponent and fan of the NTIA approach. I really like what they're doing. I like the way they're handling it. I like the fact that they're looking to the state to be the lead agency and then for us to go get sub-grantees. I think that's a fantastic approach. It allows us to start to look at this as a wholesale approach to solving the problem for the state, not fund a project over here and fund a project over there and hope we get broadband for everybody. You know, this allows the state offices to take control and really start to look at this as how are we going to solve for X? And X is everybody gets broadband, right? So now we can coordinate that.
I don't think everybody kind of gets that. I mean, you and Peggy did kind of glaze over that a little bit. Talk to me about how your state came together for the NTIA BIP grants. I want to hear a little from Peggy, but Russ, you got the floor right now. So how did you pull together an application? Many folks on this call may not know about the $288 million that was available under the NTIA ARPA-funded broadband infrastructure program. So give us a little background and what you guys pulled together up there.
Yeah, what I thought was cool about what they did is they looked to the states and said, look, you guys have a better understanding than we do about what you need. So you guys are the eligible entity. Now go find some sub-grantees, put something together and bless it from your side, and we'll fund it from this side. You know, prove it to us and show us. So we had to go through an application process. We went through an RFI. We ended up, you know, saying, hey, anybody 25.3 or less, counties less than 50,000. That was kind of their thing. So kind of crushed a little bit of the opportunity here in the state, but it gave me an opportunity to really look, you know, because when I put the RFI out, immediately I got $300 million worth of projects. You know, we could only ask for 30 million. You know, and we know that we're only going to get 7 or 8, probably all of us, but we're all going to put in our $30 million application. So we went and, you know, looked at what, and it was a great process for us to bring both public and private folks together, determine what's best. I'm working on patchworking the state together. So as I'm looking at certain counties, I see this project coming in the south, that project going from the south up. I can bring this together and start to really work on playing blackout bingo with the state of Washington, right? You know, so that's what we're doing. And I think that is the way we're going to solve this problem in this country. Not at a federal desk saying, here's some money, let's go, but to allow these states to really get engaged and force the providers to have the conversation, right? Again, that's why I'm saying community up. Community up is forcing the providers to come to the table and have a more intelligent conversation around how we're going to solve it and not block for their protect their private interests, but come to what the mission is. The mission is everybody gets served. When that's the loudest voice in the room, we're going to win, you know? So that's the approach that we've done here.
So Peggy, did you guys, I heard you saying how you're changing your approach in Maine. Did you guys with the NTI BIP program, did you actually target areas? Did you solicit applications? So help me, walk me through that.
We did both. So the NTIA required that a public, I forget what the exact word, a political subdivision of the state or the state had to be the applicant. And when we looked across our landscape, it was pretty clear that there was no political subdivision that was going to do this, right? They're not putting it to put together a good competitive grant. So we took the lead on it. We issued an RFI and got responses back and then compared them to what the NTIA priorities are. And we had, we knew in our mind that we wanted a grant around 30 million bucks. And so when we finished the RFI, we had extra money. So we used our mapping process with Metro to look at areas of the state that would be a good match for the federal program. And then we went to the providers in those areas and the communities in those areas and said, you fit. Would you like to put in a proposal? And so the result was we have our incumbent provider put in 3 proposals for different parts of the state. We have 3 municipalities that came in with projects, 1 on an island and 2 in, a rural county. And then we have a small ILEC in the coastal area who's expanding their footprint. So all of the communities that are engaged in this had been part of a community planning process. So they were sort of ripe for this to happen. And using this broadband television platform that we've been working on with Metro and the geo mapping that we've been doing, the speed testing mapping, we were able to really sort of look at areas that could fit the NTIA criteria along with getting an RFI. So we did a both step. One, do you want to be part? And when we found we had space left in the grant, we then went out and actively, aggressively asked people to join.
Thanks, that's helpful. So Leslie, I hate to put you on the spot, but if you've got some, I don't want to keep you from engaging in this one. How did Louisiana approach, for example, RDolph and Reconnect, and then, ultimately what we were talking about here is NTIA's BIP program. Were those tools in your toolkit, or how is that affecting Louisiana's solution for broadband?
Well, Louisiana is still legislatively, we're still focused on providers providing broadband. So our mission was to just assist what providers wanted to apply. There wasn't any coordinated effort at the time. And so that's just timing of where we started, when we started, putting our commission together and when everything started falling into place. A couple of things I did want to jump in. You talked a lot about planning, and there's funding that we have gone after for planning, and something I wanted to talk about, just kind of swimming in your lane, only swimming together in your lane. But I hate to keep going back to your speaker last time was from EDA. So Louisiana was able to apply to EDA for planning grant money statewide. So we connect with our planning districts that are an extension of EDA to actually be hubs of information and planning for each of the districts in Louisiana. And so that was one grant. And then one of the districts went after additional USDA funding for planning. And so that was pretty, they kind of went, that was like Russ said, cool before cool. That happened. They started this process, and the EDA process was all started before the pandemic. So, it just timed it right. But that's something. And when we're talking about RDolph and the CAF funding and everything, that's mostly for providers, right? So what we're doing and really trying to look at how can we make the most of what we've got? How do we play the hands that we're dealt? Well, that's where that public-private partnership comes in. And I know that y'all heard that a lot last time, and I'm gonna sing that over and over and over to you again today, that there's the municipalities, your local governments, your Indian tribes, they qualify for funding that private providers do not. So if you're only focused on providers, on that RDolph, on that, on whatever FCC is doing with the CAF and everything, even a lot of the USDA funding, you are getting cut out of money. The ones that are going to be successful are the companies, the communities that are going to make this partnership work. And that's what I hope that our message is, that you get from me anyway.
I appreciate that, Leslie, and I'm hearing you loud and clear. We danced a little bit around mapping, guys, and I want to dig a little deeper into your experiences with mapping. Get a little bit more, you'll love this term, granular, right? Because that's what we're all trying to figure out, where broadband is and isn't, and how do you make sure, right, Russ, that you're not overbuilding, and how, Peggy, how do you make sure you get to the cranberry farms, right? That maybe they've got wireless service, but is that sufficient for what they need to run their businesses out there? So tell us a little bit, and Peggy, I'm going to pick on you first. Help me understand. When you started looking at mapping, many of our states began back in 2009, right? With the ARPA fund, with the ERA funding. Boy, my A's are all getting mixed. The ERA funding, and kept, in the state of Colorado, for example, we kept that mapping up. But I know some states didn't have that. Did you feel like you were starting from just ground zero and having to come up with a mapping solution for your state? And tell us, kind of walk us through that and what it looks like and what kind of data you're collecting.
So for a long time, we've collected data from the providers, which is essentially their 477 data, and published that in a public map. Ironically enough, the map was so inaccurate that my predecessor in these positions had to take it down because the providers were unhappy that the map was that inaccurate, even though it was their data. When I came in, we republished that map and went back out to providers and said, listen, we'll sign all kinds of NDAs, whatever you want us to do. give us better data. And there were a couple of providers who did, right? The cable company had no interest, but our incumbent providers said, we can do that for most of our footprint. And so our map got a little better. We then have made several other sort of attempts to sort of compile this together. The big piece that we did last year was we engaged geo partners in this crowdsourced speed testing. Now, I will say that the provider community is sort of unhappy with it, but and it does two things for us. One is it gives us sort of on the ground street level data, which we didn't have before. The other thing that it does, which is equally important, is it gives communities a tool to organize around, right? Whenever the communities start planning, the first thing they want to know is who's got what. This gives them a tool that they can go out and engage their community members. And it's been really, really important and a really huge, even if the data they got was inaccurate, the actual process of doing that has been so valuable, but the data isn't inaccurate. But so then we also engaged it's a Maine company, but it's global, called Vetro Fiber, which many of our providers use. And it really is a very in-depth mapping process. And we're creating a platform that brings in the geo data, brings in the provider data that Vetro gets and uses, brings in the data that companies have to report to us by law. And it's gonna create, or is creating, a platform that layers all that stuff on in a very useful way. And it will have both a front-facing piece that people can look up and see what the data is and add to that data by doing speed testing, and a back-facing piece that helps us both look better at how we're doing grants to make sure we're not leaving orphans out there, so we can actually look and see, okay, if you're going to design this network, don't do it just for this town. Don't forget those 2 streets off of this town that have 5 people that live just over the border. Bring them into your grant so we're not leaving orphans out there, right? So this platform is really going to help us really enable to better use these federal funds. The new funding that came out yesterday, the guidelines, talk about they really are looking for states to come in with project areas. This is going to help us. All these data pieces, I know it sounds like we're doing a lot of them, but data, Russ says if you don't measure it, you're not going to fix it. This gives us the information we need to both target that area and to better serve that area and to figure out the best way to do that. So we sort of have a number of platforms, but they're all working together to create a really intelligent look at what we have for information in Maine.
Thanks, Peggy. Hey, Matt, I realize you joined just at the simple part of the conversation. Hey. We're talking about mapping. No, not a difficult part at all. I want to remind everyone on the call that Matt is the director of the Illinois Office of Broadband, and he had a conflict today. And I didn't throw you under the bus, Matt, but I'm so glad you've been able to join us. So right now we've kind of covered what the mission of each state broadband office is. We've talked a little bit about how you're using state funding and then federal funding, and now we're kind of diving into mapping. So if you want to jump in right here and kind of give us like a summary of those 3 items, I know you're really good at getting the details out quickly. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment, because I've been telling everybody they need to wait for you to join too. So.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm so sorry I'm late. But Teresa, thanks for the invitation. And I just really thank you all for your interest in broadband. And I know that this is the moment for all of us to be thinking about how to collaborate and adopt best practices and innovate where we can. And so it's just always exciting to join this kind of conversation. And I know what you're doing in Colorado is just amazing, and it has been for some time. But that doesn't mean we can't push each other to do better and to do more. And we're going to have to, with all the federal dollars coming down the pike. And so, from our standpoint in Illinois, we've been at this for a couple of years now. Governor Pritzker and the General Assembly invested $400 million in a state matching grant program back in 2019. And so that kind of pushed us in a position as we were standing up our Office of Broadband in the fall of 2019, working with our OAD Broadband Advisory Council to put together an approach for a state grant program that could handle that number of dollars efficiently and effectively, and also make sure that we have a holistic approach to the undertaking so that we seized the opportunity. We're going to do it once, we're going to do it right. And so our goal quickly is, ubiquitous or universal broadband access at 100 by 20 throughout the state to homes, businesses, community anchor institutions. All of the investments that we're making with public dollars need to to be scalable to at least 100 megabit per second symmetrical service. So we are investing in the future, not just for the needs of today, but for the needs of tomorrow. And I think the key here, and this is particularly true in the pandemic and all the federal resources coming down the pike, is the critical importance of investing in community planning and in capacity building. You know, State Office of Broadband is great, but it's really the local communities, our provider community, the partnerships that forge along the way that make this a successful endeavor. And so we have our Illinois Connected Communities program that focuses on that local planning, capacity building, setting a community-specific broadband vision. And now with the resources that are available, we hope that every community in Illinois can take advantage of them and make their visions a reality. And so I think the key here is just a holistic approach to broadband, and that includes investing in mapping. No mapping is perfect, as you've heard from Peggy and Russ and Leslie. I mean, Teresa, you all know it. But it's a good start of a conversation. And I think that mapping has come such a long ways in the last decade. And it's really exciting to see what states are doing to innovate on this end, adding a lot of value and hopefully leading our federal friends to invest in smart mapping at the federal level. And so with that said, I'd be happy to say a little bit more about mapping if you'd like. Otherwise, really pleased to join you all today. And thanks so much for the invitation.
Thanks, Matt. You caught up quickly, as I knew you would. I wanted to just make a blanket statement. The panelists today, we're not advocating, this panel is not advocating any particular vendors at all. We're just, what we've asked the panelists to do is to speak to what they're doing. So that does have names attached to it when it comes to mapping. So just a disclaimer, so I don't get myself in trouble. We're not advocating for any particular vendors out there. We're just asking our panelists to educate everyone on what they're doing. So, hey, Russ, dive in. I know you've done some creative things on mapping. And Matt, I'm going to come back to you to get some specifics, but I wanted Russ to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Matt, good to see you. Hey, and I was thinking too, I've got to bounce for a Montana meeting here. I've got to help them. So Matt will take my place. When I'm done with this little speak here, then Matt can be be the new guy, and I'll go on. But I have really appreciated the opportunity to be here. But let me, really quickly, because mapping was critical. I found that out when I was in Wyoming, especially because we were so sparse and so spread out. A pioneer state, frontier state. I mean, where you've got 500,000 people in a state, this big, and it was a pretty intense effort when you look at the 477 data, and it's all shapefile data, and everybody, broadband covers this perfect square, and we all know that's not correct. And when you're out in these rural areas, you've got these farmers, and we're starting to talk about precision ag and ranchers and whatnot, and we need to get broadband out to those corners. And unfortunately, the maps were inadequate. So we really did go straight to a crowdsourcing deal. And look, once you understand broadband and how it's done, it's not rocket science. This is not mystery, right? You've got copper, you've got fiber, you've got wireless, you've got a couple other technologies, but for the primary focus is copper and fiber right now. And if you understand copper infrastructure, you're asymmetrical. You're never going to get to the symmetric speeds, with the exception of some of that short hop stuff now on as long as you got fiber out as far as you can to get that copper fed in there. So currently what we have to do is really look at that fiber infrastructure. So if you look at a crowdsourced map, immediately you can start to see what technologies are in those regions. And if you have a little bit of knowledge in the space, the map that I use right now, it's the only thing I do because it also has some analytics behind it. It's got some financial modeling behind it. I can grab those spaces, look at them, identify where I've got certain types of infrastructure that are not going to be adequate to meet the 150 symmetrical goals of this state. And then I can build a quick network, and I understand some costs, and I can start to talk more intelligently with providers. I can talk more intelligently with public infrastructure and grant funders and say, look, estimate right now, is this, and we're going to need that money here. And so, we've really gone to, we've gone all in on this community up efforts around this. Providers got their information, and that a lot of provider pushback on that, but having been in the industry, I'm able to handle that, because providers are afraid that you're gonna expose the, hey, up to 25.3. We didn't promise 25.3. Well, that infrastructure is no longer capable of doing what's needed for today's homes. And so we do need to start to look at lift in place. And so as a result too, as states, we have to also have that understanding that these incumbents that have built these networks are going to need some funds to help them lift in place that infrastructure, if in fact we're going to put that on them. So we have to have that conversation. So this state also is very much focused on incumbent first. We got to take care of that. And if the incumbent wants to play, we want to play too. The incumbent doesn't want to play, and there's some bigger incumbents that are kind of walking away from that carrier last resort responsibility, then we'll figure out what the alternatives are, whether that's the competitive carriers or private or public infrastructure, right? But the mapping for us has really allowed us to start to get a lot more intelligent. Like Peggy said, it empowers those communities, gets them excited. They get behind it. We then have dashboards that we hand out to communities every month so they can see what's going on. They can, it kind of becomes that United Way bubble, right? That you see when you're trying to get the funds and make that thermometer pop out the top, right? As you start to see that, we start to get some confidence intervals. We have statistical validations to our tools. And sure, you're going to get the one-offs. You're going to get the people that, have a bad wireless router in their house that only does 100 megabits and they got gigabit service, but they're only showing 100 megabit. We know that we're going to get a few of those. So we don't act on onesie twosies. We look for sample data that kind of proves a point.
So Russ and Peggy, what I'm kind of hearing from both of you is if you have a tool that maps where broadband is and isn't, and then have some overlays for estimating the cost, does that give your legislators a little bit more comfort when you're looking at dollars to fix and patch those holes? And I'm going to invite Leslie and Matt to jump in on this one too and have those conversations, because Leslie, I know you're getting in the same boat with mapping. Was the draw to also be able to scope the size of the problem in those unserved areas?
I can tell you that immediately we started being able to identify school-age children that did not have internet at all, right beside children or families that had really good internet, which told us that they couldn't afford it. There was some kind of issue there. We were able to address it quickly. So yes, it is going to be, well, ours is new, is just getting built up, but we are really looking forward to being able to use that as a tool for going after, helping our legislature, looking at what needs to happen where, working with our congressional folks to pull down funding other than the regular pots of money, actual infrastructure stuff. And bye, Russ, we love you. We'll vote you in. You have to buy the king cake next time. So
I'm in. Thanks. Bye-bye.
But that it's been we've been able to really look at some communities already. I mean, and we literally just started in April. We've really been able to pull up some communities and see what's where and where it is just not. And it's coming up to be a lot of folks that can't afford it. And so that's something that, we haven't talked about today, but that's an issue that we're really coming up with the emergency broadband benefit program. We've been able to really push that through our state because of our mapping program that just started in April.
Matt, you want to add to that on the mapping issue? Does the ability to scope the size of the, not just identify where it isn't, but an estimate of the cost of serving it, is that part of your process as well?
Yeah, so in Illinois, we have a mapping vendor that's been at work collecting data from providers for the last year. We had our first iteration of our map that was published July 1. And we're coupling that with at-home kind of speed test data and also in the field kind of validation or field work to make sure that we're triangulating to get at the most accurate map that we can. And so we love the fact that the Delta Regional Authority actually works its way up the Mississippi River into the southern part of Illinois. And so we have a full dozen or so counties in the southern part of the state that are engaged in a mapping effort of their own that pairs with ours. And so I just think that that's great. There's not one way to do this. And I think that complementary efforts like that help us innovate, put our finger on an approach that can be scaled elsewhere or replicated. And so the mapping conversation, I think, has come so far at the state level over the last decade, as all of our panel appreciates and has been driving directly. And so I think moving forward, what I would like to get out of mapping, and this would be ideal if it was available at the federal level as a tool to states and local communities, is address-specific data that a local community leader is able to zoom in and say, this is my community. And we've heard through anecdotes that there are areas where you've got, poor service that need investment, but we're able to zoom in and actually see how many households, how many businesses are lacking that connectivity, so that you actually can take the first steps of putting together the pre-engineering work and saying, all right, this is what a project could look like in our area. And so that you're not starting from scratch, that you're not having to go out and seek out that data, but rather it's there for you. You can use it as a launching point to talk about how to use the funding that's available to you, how to go into conversations about partnership or investment. It's been an unknown, at least from a data standpoint in the past. I think having that as a basic assumption of the knowns that we have as we start these conversations will put our communities and our states in a much better position to, I think, take advantage of the dollars that are available. And so I get excited. Mapping is the area where we see states really innovating and doing some great work. And I would just say Illinois is, trying to catch up with some of those leaders.
Hey, Peggy, I'm going to ask you to join in, but I'm going to add an extra wrinkle to it. Are you guys collecting any pricing? Are you collecting pricing data to deal with, as Leslie brought up, the issue of affordability? So how are you? Jump on in, Peggy.
So our rule does require reporting of pricing data, but at this point with 2 staff, we don't have the capacity to like keep it someplace, right? So it is a sort of required piece that they report, but that's like for us, it's the next step. But when part of the community broadband plan is to in fact identify affordability, the affordability problem in your community, right? And some of that is really just looking at basic census data, right? How many poor people live in your town? And I got to say, many people are very surprised at how many poor people live in their town, right? They're very surprised. And so that helps a community who's thinking about universal service as their goal to suddenly understand, we're going to do universal service. We need something else here. We need to make sure that it's an affordable piece. And that helps drive a decision around decision making, right? All right, who's going to own it? Who do you want as a provider? All of that kind of stuff. I will say the EBB, and hopefully in the package that's in the infrastructure package, is another $14 billion for an expansion or of that program, is going to be really important. And I think it's important for 2 reasons. One is it provides a significant amount of money for an underwriting and affordability piece, so that states can use the money that's being provided through the federal government to build that infrastructure that people can then use that affordability money for. Because we hear a lot, we should just develop our own state program, and they're really expensive. And I think the job for states is to figure out, as we build this infrastructure, how to drive down the cost of a build all the way through from the beginning to the end. So when you get to a customer, there is a lower cost to that customer for that service that then the federal program can layer on top of. That if all we do is just write checks to providers for the service that they provide and never think about how we drive down the cost so that when we're all done, there's a more affordable piece at the end for everybody, then we've missed a piece, we've missed a boat. And that's a piece that we all really need to think about. And that goes back to a conversation around middle mile, around peering, around public infrastructure, around access, around poles, all of the kind of stuff that customers don't see, right? Customers sees the wire coming into their house, but there's a whole piece behind that that we as states need to pay attention to. And some of this mapping really helps us figure some of that out, right? Where is the cost structure that we can, in Maine, we know one of our cost problems is that we have essentially one pipe coming into the state, right? It's a problem. And so how do we as a state, and I think this federal money gives us an opportunity to step back and really as states think about that, using the data from mapping, using the data from community planning, and really understand where all the components of this are so we can drive down the cost around that affordability piece.
I appreciate that. Matt and Leslie, I want to invite you in, and I'm going to change this just a tidge, but stay in the same lane. What's the current largest roadblock you see in deploying broadband in your state? Is it affordability, or is it availability, or is it? I know in a way that's a softball question. What are you struggling with? But I do want to hear what you think is. You're looking at what your state has funded, what you have set aside for funding for projects, the mapping and all of that. But what are you worried about? What keeps you up at night that's going to be your roadblock to deploying broadband?
Take that.
Sure, I can. Oh, go ahead, Leslie. Go ahead.
I'll be honest with you. I'm afraid we're going to spend a whole bunch of money and get some infrastructure in here and they're not going to use it. Yeah, I literally seen that happen in my community. About 18 years ago, we got a RUS grant from USDA, and it was like Cadillac broadband to a very underserved community that had nothing, and a little village. And, you know, that's actually knocked us out of funding almost 20 years now because of that, because it was 10-1, it was Cadillac back then. But that community died. It was like giving somebody a car that didn't know how to drive. And unless we are going to, at the same time we are building this out, the same time we're putting together partnerships, the same time we're making it affordable by using the partnerships, we have got to be able to get folks to make sure they're using it properly. And we're doing a little bit of that in Louisiana. We've got some projects. We're putting telehealth in schools in almost all of our parishes. We're, you know, getting real inventive about how we are partnering with some of our community colleges and universities with VR glasses, with rural schools and educational groups that don't have certified teachers. You know, so we're trying to get folks involved, but I'm really afraid we're going to spend a whole bunch of money and folks aren't going to use it.
Matt, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah,
What are you worried
yeah,
about?
I think for our part, it's just looking at the historic investment that we're seeing at the state level around the country. And when Illinois started this program 2 years ago, you know, I don't want to say we're the only show in town, because that's not true. Colorado, I mean, Maine, states across the country, we're doing really great work. But what we've seen is just a doubling, tripling down on that. And so the investment, what does that mean? You know, the back order of fiber and related inputs, the talent, whether it's consultants or personnel, there are going to be multiple pinch points in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly in the next couple. And so how does the state plan for that? And how do you try to facilitate, I think, solutions that get around some of the pressures? And so the cost of goods and materials is going to be one thing, but the availability of crews to do the work is going to be another. And so we've asked for this historic moment in federal funding. Can we take advantage of it? And I think that there is a narrow window for getting this right. And a lot of the factors are out of our control. And so what can states do to facilitate the investment in broadband? We're in a pandemic. We're going to have global supply challenges. What can we do to facilitate this investment? And I would say status quo, the way your state's been going about this for the last 10 or 20 years isn't going to do it. You've got to accelerate the investment and look at this broadband investment as a unique investment in the history of your state and align the state to take advantage of it. If you don't, you're gonna feel the consequences of that for a generation or more. And so that would be the thing that keeps me up at night. We're experiencing it in Illinois. States that get ahead of that are going to be better off for it, and they're going to make better uses of their funds. So that's my 1, 2, and 3 priority.
I hear you
Oh,
perfectly timed.
Teresa, before Peggy jumps in, I wanted to remind everybody, you know, we've been here before. This isn't really new. And it happened, actually, it was before I was born, but in the 60s, USDA sent out a whole bunch of money, just big old pot of money, and said, everybody put out your own water systems. So guess what we're doing now? We are consolidating all of these teeny little bitty water systems because they can't sustain themselves and nobody upgraded their infrastructure and took care of them. We've been here before. This is the same deal. We've just got to figure out how not to make those mistakes.
Peggy, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things. First off, I think Matt's absolutely right about the supply chain issue. And in our state, we have a lot of small providers, and so they will be sort of at the end of the line as Verizon and all these big guys sort of decide to fiber out. They're going to have, so that's an issue. You know, one of the things that I worry about is the speed everybody wants to do this with. And I don't mean that we shouldn't do it fast, but I mean, we should do it thoughtfully, right? So everybody's sort of in this panic mode. We have to get something in place right now. We have to do it. And this, you know, the federal money is flexible, right? The American Rescue Plan, you don't have to make a commitment until 2024. You don't have to build until 2026. Yeah. You have time to plan and think. What I don't want to have happen is that communities get overwritten by providers, right? So that the private providers come in and they say, we're gonna do you, don't worry about it. And then, what's going to happen in this industry, it happens in every industry, there will be consolidations. Who we know now as providers will not be providers soon, right? Cable companies are shifting, the whole marketplace is shifting. And so the fear that I have is that communities lose their voice in this rush to get what they need for infrastructure that's going to last for 50 years, right? And so I think that is a really important consideration, is how we make sure these communities have a decision that they can say, no, you know what? I do not want coax. I want fiber. And they can get that. I think that that's, to me, that's a really important conversation that is because this is, as Matt said, this is a once in a lifetime conversation. So at the state level, at you guys level, at this committee level, somebody asked about how they can all work together. One of the things that we do in Maine, which I think is really, it may be because we didn't have any resources, we're all at the table together because we all have the same want. We want to make sure everybody has the broadband that they're going to need now and in the future to do what they need to be economically viable. And that takes putting egos aside. It takes putting a whole bunch of stuff aside and just focus on the goal. And I think that to me is a really important step for all of us to do right now, right? This federal money's coming, absolutely. Let's not panic. Let's focus. Let's think about it. Let's make sure we have the information we need to make decisions and to make sure communities have a voice in those decisions.
Well, I really appreciate you guys. I like the concept of, not panicking, going forward thoughtfully, public-private partnerships with community engagement. I think that, we hear a lot about P3s, but I think it needs to be that adder, right? Our best practice, that if we get the communities engaged, we get a more fulsome conversation about what those communities want their future to look like, right? And so as we look at that, I know, guys, that it was just released yesterday, but the U.S. Treasury, put out their guidance. And I know you guys have at least seen the bullet points on it, right? So for the $10 billion in capital projects funds, what do you think? What's your initial response to it? What are you seeing as the pros and cons? If there's no cons, that's fine too, but I'm just wanting to pick a little at your brains. Matt, I'm going to go with you first. You're in my right-hand corner. So yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot first, and I'm going to let the ladies think about what they want to say.
Let's see, I'll launch right in. I think that there's a lot of alignment with what Treasury is doing with the Capital Projects Fund and the best practices that have been established at the state level over the last 10 years. That's not without exception, but I think by and large, we see a lot of alignment. And so I'll just tell this group, what we're doing in Illinois, it's a copy and paste from what we did in Minnesota when I was a legislator there, standing up Minnesota's Office of Broadband and its matching grant program back in 2013. And we see similarities from Minnesota that was based on other best practices to Illinois to what's happening at the U.S. Treasury. And that's great. I think the idea of scalability, that we're making the investment once, that it's going to serve us for the long haul, I think that's really important. I think
he needs to work on his broadband.
I think I might have lost you guys. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Did we lose Matt?
We lost Matt.
Doggone it. All right. Hey, jump in, Peggy or Leslie, whoever wants to go.
Here's what I would say. Yay, Treasury, you redefine broadband as 100 over 20. Go for, people have been pushing the FCC to do that for ages, and Treasury just said, we're doing it. And so that is huge, right? It is huge because when you build out these networks, if you can only fund 25.3, you do sort of this, what I refer to as you miss the willies to get to the wags. And when you're building a network, you got to build everybody, right? And so that new thing is huge. That's a big piece. I think the fact that they're allowing states to sort of chunk up projects and apply for these sort of a project at a time, and the project can be as big or small as you want, is helpful for states, right? It gives us an opportunity to say, okay, let's do this in this area, see how it works, rather than put all the money out. I think that's a smart way to do it. It also takes some of the pressure off for us to have a plan by December, right? So we're going to have an initial plan and then really begin to put in pieces in place over the next year or so. I think that's really, really important. But to me, the big piece, when I saw that 100/20 as unserved, I was like, yay!
I was excited about that as well, but I'm still hung up over the P3. So they're really, and look, y'all, I am actually one of the funders, okay, for a federal funder for infrastructure and things like that. And that's what we are targeting. We are looking for actual public-private partnerships, and to have other funders, other federal funders step up and say, yes, that's what we want to see. We're going to put money into it. That's where all of us are going. USDA is going that way. And now Treasury. I mean, that's just where it's headed. We just got to, get our mindset to this is how this is supposed to work. And that's how we're going to get funding. Welcome back, Matt.
Yes. Leslie did it for me. Invite you back in. Come on, tell us finish your sentence.
I'm not immune from the broadband challenges of the 21st century, so apologies. I won't repeat everything, but I think the point that I was trying to drill home is what we see with the Capital Projects Fund through Treasury and building off of state established best practices. And so it aligns really closely with what we're doing in Illinois. And because of the fact that we've been moving, tranches of $25, $50 million to the crack here for our first couple of rounds of Connect Illinois, we feel like the scalability piece is on par with what we've done. And so we hope that continues moving forward. I think one challenge that I'm just anticipating is if federal infrastructure bill investments have different language that doesn't build off of the state best practices. States should be anticipating that and how to pair maybe more restrictive infrastructure dollars with, I think, more, best practice oriented Treasury dollars in the Capital Projects Fund. I know Teresa, Peggy, Leslie, you guys all know this, but I think that's just the point that states should be thinking about how to take full advantage of those different pots of funding. But of course, the infrastructure bill is still being discussed, and so we'll see what comes of that.
Well, guys, I want to be respectful of time and see if there are questions that our board members have specifically. I'm going to invite them, the board members, Bob, Jerry, Carrie, Antonio. If you have questions for the panel, please jump in, and following your questions, board members, I'm going to open it up to the public. So Carrie, I see you up there. Do you have one already?
No questions. You saw my comment in the chat. Wow. Just want to underscore what a huge opportunity that is for communities that are serving safety net populations. And we've been advocating for some time for 2021 broadband speeds. So just going on camera to say this is incredible, and we'll be sharing that internally and just promote that as it comes together. So really excited for that direction from the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah, I'm with you, Carrie. So commissioners, please, I don't want to intend to put you on the spot, but I do want to make space for you to ask questions. I mean, these guys are national experts. They are the folks I go to when I have questions. So please jump in and ask any questions you may have of them.
Jerry put a question in the chat.
Yeah, Jerry had a couple questions, and thank you for the opportunity. I did put the.
No, Jerry, you're muted.
I just wanted to thank you. I did put in a couple questions in the chat, and they were responded. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay.
Hey, so it's Antonio. So my questions are going to be, we're really under the gun to make sure we have a strategy to do our investment. My team's been asked by our governor, by our boss, to make sure that we have a really concise strategy for how we're going to invest these federal funds. But the reality is, I mean, our programs are only the size that our programs are. I know our service providers, I know how we deploy our broadband. What are you all thinking in terms of, we know there's going to be infrastructure funding. Are you building strategic plans? Are you building 5-year plans? Do you have a layout even with your mapping systems and or with your data?
Well, yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. So what and there was a question in the chat kind of goes along with that. Our governor is famous for when there's an issue, he pulls everybody on all sides of whatever the issue is into a room and he says, this is the goal, this is where we need to be. Y'all are the solution, find it. And he walks out and locks the door. You know, after a while, somebody's going to need to go to the bathroom and you start getting hungry like real quick because you know you can't go to the kitchen. So you actually start working together, and that's what that's how, you know, a lot of this happens, and that's how we need to be looking at our communities. You pull in everybody. You have planning and development districts. You've got chambers. You've got, you know, all of your universities folks, and just get everybody together and start working on it. People that have not been in the conversation before, like in Louisiana, our municipalities have not been in the conversation. We are pulling in everybody and saying, you know, let's talk about it. Even the ones that, you know, don't just talk to the ones that are the experts in the field. We got to have everybody to the table.
Yeah, I would say that it's really important in having all of the players at the table. I think one of the things that we forget about in this whole piece is what are the roles of state government as a business? What do we need? What do towns need? What do counties need? And how can you leverage that investment? So that really needs to be part of your plan. It isn't just how you're going to serve these communities, it's also how you're going to serve yourself as a state, right? And how you can leverage, you're already going to spend money, how you're going to leverage your state investment to improve opportunities. So that really should be one of the many pieces that's on the table to talk about, is how does the business needs of your public institutions help leverage additional funding and additional opportunities for communities that they're in. You know, there's a couple ways you can go at it by a data. You can say we're going to do this here. You can go up by need, right? You can do what we need to hit, telehealth we need to have. So you can have specific goals about who you're going to serve, or you can have broader goals about what is it we want this infrastructure to accomplish. Right. And then that gives you a goal of what you need to some extent to get there, and then begin to put those partnerships in place that move you to that direction.
I think for my part, I would just build off of what Leslie and Peggy had to offer, which I think is great insight. I think that community level engagement, just building off of that awareness and the partnership opportunities, really makes a lot of sense. In Illinois, we don't have a detailed strategic plan. I think ours is more of a vision kind of statement, how we go about integrating program funding, what are our goals, generally kind of setting the general rules of the road. How are we going to move forward with our program? But I think moving forward, we definitely want to get more granular in our understanding of where there may be market-driven solutions to filling in the map and making investments, where we have community energy and maybe a willingness to use some of those ARPA dollars or infrastructure dollars at the community level to pair with what we would invest through our Connect Illinois program. I think understanding how different technology and maybe other federal funding programs line up. And so I know that we put forward an application with a lot of other states, I think 49 other states earlier this summer in August for the NTIA's Broadband Investment Program. And that was really instructive in looking at how the map of eligibility areas matches up against, you know, where other program funding may be, where other provider investments may be taking place. And so I think that's the sort of effort that we'll be moving forward with more organically. And again, playing off of the mapping resource that we're just standing up right now. I don't want to come at this and say, hey, the state has the answers and we're gonna guide all of the investment and drive the partnerships moving forward. I really want to inspire local communities in our provider community to step up and say, hey, we have some ideas. We recognize that the map says this is an area that's unserved or underserved. We'd like to be part of the solution. And so I think it's that balance between providing leadership and thinking strategically about this at the state level, but also empowering our local communities and providers to be part of that conversation and to help get us to that sweet spot, if you will. And so I know that sounds really high level and not specific, but I don't know if there's one way about going about this. And I think the states that have a real detailed plan on how they're going to fill in the map, they're either really close to filling in the map or else they've been at this for a while. And so I think a lot of states are in the same boat in terms of thinking about how to use these historic dollars to the best. And I think that's going to take a lot of thought, looking at maps, looking at where other investments going to be taking place, pairing that against your community and state goals. And so that's a whole nother conversation, at least 2 hours, but I think a fundamental question. Yeah, great question.
Right. So Matt and Peggy and Leslie, I want to make sure the audience gets a chance to ask you any questions too. I did promise them that they audience members could take themselves off mute and ask questions. So I want to honor that in the last, I think we've got about 10, 15 minutes left, right, Sarah? So if there's someone out there in the audience that has a question, please unmute yourself and ask.
Teresa, I have been gathering the questions from the chat. So I can call on those people who put things in the chat if their questions weren't answered. The first is Ralph Brown. If you want to take yourself off mute.
Sure, I think my questions have been answered. Thanks.
Okay. All right, great. We had a question from Kate Sneed. Kate, do you want to ask your question?
Agreed, mine have been answered. I was just really curious around the third party Tilson and how you're going about testing all of that. But unless there's someone besides Tilson or a different methodology, I think it was answered.
Okay. Amy Switek, did you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, I think they were partly answered. One was just, but I'd love to hear any more answers to this around ways of supporting and funding that community engagement and planning piece. And Peggy, I think you spoke a little bit too about your relationship with the Maine Community Foundation. So I might reach out to them as well. I'm with Philanthropy Colorado.
Yeah, you should do that. They have they took a huge lead a couple of years ago and funded essentially a full-time position at the Maine Broadband Coalition because they saw a lot of the things that they were interested in, healthcare, education, all tied back into broadband. And so they sort of stepped back and realized we have to support this effort to expand broadband. And so they're doing it in a couple different ways. One is they do support a community planning process that we all sit on each other's grants committee for these community planning process. There's 4 of us who judge them sort of in every, so every organization has one. It's essentially the same 4 people that look them over, which is really advantageous because we know who's coming in, we know who's asking for what, we know who's asking who for what, and we also can move resources around, right? This isn't exactly the right spot for them, but this might be. So I think that's a really helpful kind of collaborative thing.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Matthew Albertson.
Basically, I was just wondering how contractors or consultants, different people that have different talents can get involved and get directed to the right people to just help with all of these initiatives.
Louisiana, we are directing providers to partner with our local governments. So in our grant program, they get extra points if they have formed that partnership. And I know in a lot of the federal funding, you get priority. So we just direct you to partner with your local governments.
And Teresa, I think I've heard you say this, but one of the roles of an Office of Broadband is to be a matchmaker. And so I think that's absolutely critical. But ways in which consultants or others who can provide really key inputs and contributions to this effort can join the conversation, in my mind, is taking advantage of these sorts of conversations, these dialogues, jumping in to the webinar conversation, putting your contact information in the chat. I mean, just really join the conversation, literally. I think different offices of broadband across the country, though, do have matchmaker kind of capacities to bring those resources on board. I know we're trying to put a toolkit together in Illinois to help communities that have funding. They just they don't know how to take those first couple of steps and to get the ball rolling, putting those resources together in a toolkit so they're not starting from square one. And so I think those are just a couple, ideas, but nothing novel there.
So we actually, we have a couple broadband consultants across the state who work with communities, and our concern is with some of these consultants is they focus on the data, looking at what's on the polls, doing, they don't really focus on building this community vision piece, and they will tell you, actually, our consultants will tell you that I don't do vision shit, right? So you have to really, that's the piece that's really important. And so one of the things that we're putting in place this year is we're calling them connectivity boosters, and they're essentially volunteers that we're going to pay with a stipend. We'll see how this works, one per county, and their job is to work with these towns to get them unstuck, to get them to a place where they can make the decision. What we find a lot of times is that communities, like, they gather data, but they don't ever get to the point where they make a decision about, are we going to own this network? Do we want fiber? Do we want universal service? Those key decisions drive a project forward and a community forward. And so we're trying to figure out a support mechanism, and these community boosters will be one. Our geotesting mapping will be another, to help move these conversations along and to make sure the communities have the support they need to actually get to the decision-making process.
Okay, great. The next question is from Craig Swetchel.
Hey, it's Craig. In these panels and these meetings, we often weight the discussion towards fiber, but where's the panels head at in terms of wireless and satellite technologies as they mature kind of rapidly?
I'm glad you asked that question. So Louisiana is kind of flat. So we're definitely looking at a lot of fiber to the home, but we recognize that in some areas where it's kind of sparsely populated, or in a farm area where we're just looking at maybe some tractor usage or something like that, we are encouraging other options. And I wanted to tell this group something real quick about satellite. I know we kind of bashed Starlink just a little bit earlier, but something that's not public, you're not going to see in the news. They actually donated about 50 units for Louisiana's coast that was devastated by Hurricane Ida. And we had no electricity, and our AT&T service went out, and we had a little bit of Verizon, but it was very little communication. It was just black. We had nothing down there. And so, to be able to have the satellite option, I mean, I really feel like there's a lane there that, there's a place for them. Just like all of these funds, we've got to figure out who qualifies for what and how we can leverage them all together. And I think that's going to fall in that category as well.
I agree. I think there is a lane for Starlink. I think it's for areas that are very hard to reach with anything else. Maine, we're essentially a granite outcropping in the ocean with a series of mountains that run through the middle of us. And so wireless is really hard. It's just really hard. And so the wireless technology is improving all the time, right? It's going to continue to improve. And for me, the basic infrastructure for all this stuff, everything goes to fiber. Everything, Starlink goes to fiber, wireless goes to everything goes to fiber. The basic infrastructure that we really need to focus on is that fiber. That's going to bring 5G out if we ever get it, but that's going to do it. So for us, building out this infrastructure as close as we can get to the home with fiber is really important. And then some of these other technologies for the very hard to reach areas are totally viable.
Yeah, I would just echo, I think, we're technology neutral insofar as we invite investment from a variety of providers using different technologies. That's absolutely important. Something that doesn't come up often enough in these sorts of conversations is just the fundamental value of competition. And so that's good. That's a good thing. We'd love to see more of it. And so I think that a variety of technology choices is good for a community and for a state. But for our part, we have taxpayer dollars that we want to invest once in an area and never go back there again. And so the point the panelists are making, if you're investing in fiber, you can be technology neutral. You can enable all sorts of different approaches to connectivity to utilize that fiber. And so that's I guess the point that we play off of. But I mean, in our Connect Illinois program, we invest in wireless as long as there's a fiber component connecting those towers, which of course there has to be. And so we welcome the investment in a variety of technologies and where we can do demonstrations or partner in other ways with different kinds of providers using different kinds of technology, we jump at that opportunity.
I think I sound like a broken record, but I know this is all one time, this big lump of money, this one-time deal. Did y'all know that there was infrastructure money before the pandemic? And there's going to be some more infrastructure money after. So with this one-time all-in stuff, public funds, you know, really use it for the concrete stuff, the infrastructure that's going to be there. And then for the infrastructure dollars that are going to come later, then do the stuff that you're going to have to replace or upgrade or whatever every 10 to 15 years or whatever. But let's use it. Let's be smart. I'm with Peggy. Let's just be real smart before we run out there and get the cheapest thing, and so we can get as much out there as we can. Let's be real smart about what we're doing.
Great. Okay. Last question is from Mitchell Gorson about middle mile networks.
We're trying to figure this out. This is a new thing for us. The you know, we know when we look at, so our lowest cost provider is the incumbent provider who owns the middle mile and owns the poles. They beat everybody by a lot on all these costs, but there are areas of the state they're not in and they don't want to be in for whatever reason, right? And so the question for us is how we drive down those costs. Like I said before, from the beginning to the end, how do we drive down those costs? And what role does middle mile play in that? I do not have an answer for that yet. We're working on it. I do not have an answer for it yet, but it is absolutely part of the questions that we have to ask.
Yeah, for our part, we have our Connect Illinois program that's focused on last mile connections, but middle mile investments, eligible cost. But I think Colorado has set a good example for the rest of the country, the critical importance of middle mile specific investments. And so without giving away next steps, I think we'll be developing complementary programming and tools that focus on that critical aspect of the divide middle mile.
Our funding really targets that last mile, but if middle mile is needed to get there, then it's included. Right. And I know a lot of other infrastructure dollars follow that suit as well.
Well, thank you, panelists. I want to just tell you how much I appreciate your time today. You guys have, I mean, this has been almost a 2-hour panel. You guys have been, I know, Matt, you had half and Russ had half, but you know, my buddies in Maine and Louisiana have stood up for 2 hours here, and Leslie since I think like 8 a.m. this morning. So I want to give you guys an opportunity just for some closing remarks. You have been exceptional. I really appreciate the insights and the best practices you've shared with us. But if there's one nugget you want to leave us all with, what would that be? So I'm going to start with you, Peggy.
Create a shared vision of what you want and why you want it. Not we want fiber. Why do you want it? What is it you're attempting to enable in your economy? To me, broadband is and can be the great equalizer. And when you think about that, providing equal opportunity to healthcare, to education for job opportunities, to be able to provide that to every citizen in your state and have them all on an equal footing is a huge piece. And if that's your thought, then figure out the pieces that get you there, right? What is it that gets you there? What do you need, not only for infrastructure, but what do you need around affordability? What do you need around digital literacy? What do you need around digital equipment? All of those things need to be part of your thought process, but it's really important to sort of begin at where you're going to end, right? Skate to where the puck's going to be, whatever little you want to use, but really think about where it is you want to be when you're done. What is it going to look like? And then build out from there.
Leslie, fill up that crawfish bowl.
Look, I totally agree with Peggy. You know, I actually named our commission Broadband for Everyone in Louisiana. That was a purpose there. Besides that, an acronym is Bell Commission, and my governor is John Bell Edwards. Yep, I did that. But he's gotten a press conference and said, I kind of like that name. I felt so good about myself. But, you know, that's our goal. And if that's not your goal, you're in here for the wrong reasons. And to make that broadband for everyone in Louisiana, it absolutely levels a playing field. I represent the most rural communities in this nation. And I'm telling you, this is what is going to be life-changing for our children and our grandchildren. And our decisions on how this works is on us right this minute. And if we are going to be focused, centered on one thing, on one provider or one pot of money, we're going to fail. We're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to think out of the box. We're going to have to partner with people and companies and agencies that we've never partnered with before. We're going to have to really think out of the box and stretch our comfort zone. And if we don't do it, we're going to fail ourselves and our kids and our future.
All right, Matt, you're batting clean
All
up
right,
here.
real quick. I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with Peggy and Leslie. So reiterate those points just quickly. You know, this is the time to be bold and to innovate and to take advantage of a historic moment. Colorado, whether you know it or not, you've been viewed as a leader in many regards on the broadband front. But any state across the country that's been doing something even successfully for the last couple of years, now is the time to look inward and think, are we doing everything we can? Are we being as ambitious as we can be? Check those assumptions that you brought into the conversation 5 or 10 years ago, because now is the time to reset, to be big, bold, and ambitious. And I just can't wait to see what states like Colorado do in the years to come. So thanks for letting me join. This is just what a great panel. So thank you. I've learned several things. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you to close everything out.
I'll just hand it on to Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Teresa, for pulling this together. I want to thank all our panelists for joining our board and sharing this with our community. Great insight, excitement around the subject. We're all passionate, even though we all work for different agencies in the state. I run the DOT side of this board. So we use the right of way to expand our fiber as well as public-private partnerships. And I appreciate the comments around that earlier. Because it's not just an industry to solve, it's not just a state to solve or locals, it is a true partnership that everyone needs to pull together to solve a common need. And on my night job, I'm a council person as well, so for a city. And as much as water is as important, I get more phone calls when the internet's down. So let's just be very clear that internet is probably equally important, if not more, sometimes in some eyes than water, unfortunately. But we need to make sure that this is something that is important. In fact, I was just messaging to show how important it is to our state, rural communities like Trinidad, which is a small community in the South. The mayor has been pinging me through this whole call right now because he's begging for me to come down there to help broadband in his community because it is an economic driver. 1 or 2 people that can have access to broadband that make $250,000, $500,000 is an economic driver for a community to thrive. And so I appreciate the thoughtful conversation that this panel's had. Teresa, thank you very much for pulling this together. Thank you for all those that have attended today. Before I end it, I just want to make sure any board member or anyone have any questions, any last minute comments before we conclude today's board meeting. Wow, I got head shaking no. So thank you very much again for attending today. And thank you for all you do and all the good work everyone does around broadband. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you for the great panel.